So they say that sitting is the new smoking. So if you would just stand for a moment. And then just sit. Oh. If you self-identify as a woman, please stand. You may be seated. If you self-identify as a man, please stand up. Please be seated. Now we're all participating. You see, he asked for participation. So now you're taking care of it, I'm taking care of it. So when I was preparing for this talk, I was getting really excited. And then Chip wrote me and he said, just make sure you know that you can't wear flip-flops to this thing. And if you know me, then you know terror set in, right? Because being barefoot is actually part of my practice, okay? Or being open is part of my practice. And tonight I'm here to speak to you about women, sexuality, and new or evolved paradigms of pleasure. So please stand if you have at least an inkling of curiosity about our topic. Peer pressure is a bitch, isn't it? So we're all on level ground, and I don't know about the pad. The pad might not be working. So I'm just here, and I'm myself, and I'm going to speak to you, hopefully from the heart, for the next 10 minutes. What I have experienced in the last 13 years of my life, studying embodiment practices, studying mindfulness and yoga, is that there's no amount of deep breathing and mindfulness that's going to close the gap of education that we need to give women back to themselves in this culture. And what does that mean? Why do we not already have ourselves under wrap? Why don't we feel like we own our bodies and we own our place in things? And why is it just not as simple as, like Chip said, grabbing empowerment and taking it, right, by the something, okay? But that's not really how it works if you want to move through the world as your authentic feminine self. It's not as simple as just plugging yourself into a masculine archetype and feeling at home in your own body. So I just want to give you an example of this. I want to start with the language. When I came in today, they said she's going to say the V word. Okay? I said, oh, that's interesting. Now it's not even vagina, it's the V word. But we all know what it means, and we all kind of have that feeling of when is the right time to use that word, right? And how comfortable are we with that? Or is it called privates? Or is it called pussy? Or is it called sex? Or is it a yoni, right? But the word vagina itself, you may or may not know the meaning of it. It means sheath. It means sheath, okay? So in our language itself, what our language is reminding our women as we grow, I was a woman growing at one point, what it's reminding us is that we only have value in relationship to something else. Our bodies only have relational value. And what that does to a growing psychology is potentially beyond our comprehension. True? Does it kind of boggle your mind what might be happening to girls who are growing up with this message? Okay. Now, I want to just say that as I take this topic kind of in my hands, that what happens for me in my body is a big deal, because we've been taught as women to come up here and just be dynamic, give you 3 things to take home with you tonight and just kill the TED Talk, right? But what's become more important to me is that I can feel my body as I speak, okay? That I could feel my feet on the ground. Or maybe even as we get further into our talk, right, that I could feel my female sexual anatomy as I walk through the world. Okay? Another example of what it feels like to grow up as a woman is this, right? you are asked to, in the context of sexual education, begin to have these conversations about who you are, what your body looks like, how it has cycles, in a context or a room with individuals that are already demeaning that cycle for you. Right? So you're growing up feeling like you can't just in your own way explore what your body is. Right? Not even to get to what it is to be in a female evolved body, right? Evolved meaning we've gone through puberty. Okay. So what I would like you to do tonight is close your eyes for a moment. And if you're not comfortable closing your eyes, then that's perfectly fine. You can stare me down. But close your eyes and think back to any conversation that you've had about female pleasure in relationship to anatomy. Notice, first of all, if you've ever had that conversation. Notice, secondly, when that conversation took place. Okay. And go ahead and open your eyes. Please stand up if you've ever had a conversation about female anatomy and pleasure. No shame. You don't have to stand up because your name is stood up. Okay. Go ahead and sit down. Please stand up if that conversation was in the last 5 years. Okay. And go ahead and sit down. Last time. Please stand up if that conversation happened before puberty. Okay.
You mean, did we have them before puberty, or was puberty within the last 5 years?
No, did you have them? Did you have those conversations before puberty? Great. Okay. Wonderful. So I fell on the spectrum of having those conversations before puberty. I was one of the lucky ones that had some conversation. Now, did it mean that that really stood as valuable in my peer community? No. Because if you've ever seen a graph of parental influence, right, and where it drops off at 12, and peer influence and where it skyrockets at 12, you realize that what your community and culture think about sexuality rules. So when we come together to look at female sexuality and embodiment, or a new paradigm of pleasure, I want us to start thinking about what the female pleasure is, not in relationship to anything or anyone else. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Because we've been taught to only have relational pleasure. Okay. Some of the archetypes of woman, when she is not, does somebody have water? I've never spoken without water. It's not wine. It's not wine. I didn't have a flask. That was really smart. But now I have like a talking piece. Okay. All right. Yeah, it's classy, they say. So when we start to have these conversations about women and sexuality, how do we have that conversation without it being about someone else or the bad things that have happened to her because some bad things have happened, correct? We know that, okay? And it's still time to tell those stories. Like, just hearing Lee speak, it's so powerful to hear anyone tell their vulnerable story. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who walked before me tonight and told a story that wasn't easy to tell, that I sat in my room and I did nothing when I could have done something. But I needed to do nothing, you know. So when we look at female sexuality, how are we starting to reframe our language? And moreover, what are the practices that get us in touch with female pleasure? And does that topic terrify you? There's some grunting. That's good. That's Does it terrify me? In a way, that's what we're talking about tonight. That maybe it should terrify you. Okay? So the clitoris is an organ that by its nature has no purpose other than pleasure. which again makes it hard to understand. We've come to talk about sexuality as we educate children in terms of progeny, right? And male orgasm is connected to progeny. So it's easy to connect the dots. But women, it's not so easy to connect the dots with. And in fact, it's like that great mystery, that big why. Then why? Why that piece of anatomy, right? Well, many reasons. And my thought is, because if a woman is truly living in her pleasure, she will change the world. That is my thought. And that's what I see in women that are essentially turned on to themselves, who have a value in themselves, not in relation to anything else, but strictly because they are enough. Yeah. And what would it be like if our girls felt like they were enough in and of themselves? The interesting thing about women is that when women see another woman suffering, they rise to the occasion. So for me to tell a friend, I'm going to call you a friend, for me to tell a friend to focus on pleasure in her life, she might not take that charge, right? But if I tell her to help her friend find pleasure and joy, she's on task, okay? So this is how female pleasure works, is that female pleasure increases every time we opt to support another woman to find her joy and her pleasure. And I don't want to kind of dumb it down into the sense of like, find general joy in all things, because that's not what I mean. I mean, in order to give women back to themselves, we actually have to give them back all of the language and all of the support to explore their own female sex organs. And what may come of that, we don't know. That's another big why, correct? What would the world be like in 20 years if we started actually informing women that they are not relationally of value, but that they actually have inherent value? So what are some of the things that you can do or you can share with the women in your life? You know, as men sitting there, well, what does that have to do with me? Right? Do you know what it's like when the women in your life, I'm not going to say you're anything, okay? That's a habit. So when the women in your life are resentful and discontented, do you know that kind of a woman? They're like, I'm not saying anything. I've never seen that kind of a woman in my house. Very smart, right? Because yes, when a woman is told that she's resentful or bitter, she also grows quickly into more resentfulness and bitterness, right? But how do we begin to transform our women from a kind of burning discontentment that comes from never being told that they have inherent value without being in a relationship? How do we start to heal that for women and for ourselves? Well, one thing you can ask the women in your life is not, and I repeat, not, what can I do for you? What do you need? What needs to be done around the house? Those questions do not connect a woman to her female sexual anatomy. In fact, they get her right up in here. Okay? And no amount of mindfulness or deep breathing is going to close the gap for us of giving back woman her inherent value. Right? And it's nothing you can take and it's nothing you can give. So when I say that, take it with a grain of salt. Okay? It's because we have to use words for these things. But she's got to recognize, and we've got to recognize on her behalf, that she's inherently valuable. So what do you ask her? There's the big why. Right? So why? Why would I get involved, right, in the woman that's in a big discontent mood? Yeah. Well, one thing you can ask is, what would bring you pleasure today? Okay, so now can I tell you what I'm seeing across the board in faces? I'm seeing little curls up on women's faces. Okay? And some women not so much. Okay? And that's okay too. Some women are like, I don't know about this conversation. Okay? But for the most part, you try it a couple times and you ask, what would bring you pleasure today? And she's like, what kind of a question is that? And then she might just say nothing, you know? She might not have no idea how to respond to that question. Well, I would never wake up and think, what would be pleasurable for me today? I would wake up with a lot of other ideas of what needed to be done, who I needed to take care of, who I needed to drop off and pick up. I'm a mother of 2, I get these things. You could also ask her, what would bring you joy today? What would bring you joy today? Do you see how it would elicit a completely different response? How would it feel for you, and this is just a rhetorical, how would it feel for you if someone first thing in the morning asked you, what would bring you pleasure today? Would you start thinking in new directions, maybe more creative directions? Now I want to take us back a step, because there's things women can do for themselves. Of course there's things women can do for themselves, but we're also in a small community, and I'm not going to divulge everything in one 10-minute talk tonight, okay? But if we look back a bit, and we really start to explore, well, when did this start to happen? When did women start to get so inherently disempowered by a cultural container? And what we actually see is when we're moving into agricultural revolution, of which there were many, when we started to separate land and men were landowners, they also were holding things like livestock, women, right? Even in the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not steal my neighbor's land or covet my neighbor's land, my neighbor's wife, my neighbor's donkeys. Okay, so we're all grouped together in that, which is very confusing, I think, to a woman who wants to have value in and of herself. Okay, so when we make that jump to agricultural societies, then all of a sudden we're looking at a new form where it makes more sense to be in a nuclear structure because that's the safest structure. But it doesn't necessarily put women on equal ground. Yeah? And then it's just a place where we can perpetuate some of these more deeply ingrained religious or cultural beliefs. Okay. So I'm going to throw it back on you a little bit tonight. And I do want this to be, my idea as well was that this was going to be a little more of a conversation because I think that you probably have some questions for me that are either doubt-based, critique-based, right? Or genuine curiosity-based. And I'm interested to understand from you kind of what this peaks for you, because this is really like a, maybe like a 6-month course or something, but we're just here tonight to kind of crack the door open to what is this all about? And maybe, my hope is that maybe tonight you go home and you research something you've never researched before, and that's like a crack in the matrix for us. Now I did promise in terms of women and themselves, what do we do, right? And I was asked recently, well, what do you do for the children? How do you teach the children? And my teacher would always tell me, you model. Because children watch, they observe. And even, especially your teenagers, right? Especially teenagers. They're not ever going to give you the right to be in charge in that moment, but they're watching you out of their peripheral. How do you feel about your sexuality? How do you feel about, being open about these things, about talking about female sexual anatomy? And if the female never gets to actually describe her anatomy without feeling like, is that the right word? Then how does she actually feel it in her body without feeling some sense of shame or confusion, right? So one of the things that we have women do in some of our longer term programs and circles that I've been a part of is we have women explore, right? It's like this big unknown thing for women. So you look, like to start off, you look, right? You look because you've been told that maybe you shouldn't, right? So you look, you feel, you start to understand. Yeah? There's actually a new form, I'm going to make sure I say this right. It's called ahedonia, and it means a non-feeling, okay? It's a segment of depression now that they've, categorized as just not being able to feel. Sorry, this slips. Not being able to feel what's actually happening to you physically, but then emotionally, right? So this is showing up in women across the board, that it's not just actually depression, it's that they can't feel what's happening physically, they can't feel what's happening emotionally, as a result of being disconnected. So for you as women tonight, I am speaking at this moment to women, yeah? For men, it's a little more straightforward, okay? We're not kids here, it's straightforward, right? But for women, it's not. So sometimes we have to have that little prompt from some piece of education somewhere to get to know ourselves anatomically, right? To start that process of revaluing self. And for men, of course, asking the questions. And for women to women, asking the questions. What would bring you pleasure? What would bring you joy? And just start to see if it cracks the disposition of the home environment. So tonight, I hope that you took away something that leaves you curious enough that you want to research further. Because in the end of the day, I'm not here giving a dissertation. I'm not here sharing a thesis with you. I'm just part of the community who thinks about these things a lot as I work with human bodies, as I work with youth, and as I work with people in yoga, and just really wanting to kind of hold that space of there's no amount of breath work that's going to fill the gap for us. And how are we going to do that together? So, thank you.